Perfect. So Thea Cox is a project manager in the Estuaries and Wetlands team at ZSL, that's the Zoological Society of London. And she's led ZSL and partners' annual survey of seal populations in the Thames for the past 4 years. And she's going to speak to us this evening about that monitoring marine mammals in the Thames. So I'm going to stop my screen sharing now and hand you over to Thea.
Hello, I will just share my screen. 2 seconds. Can everyone see? Should see a picture of a seal.
It's not sharing yet.
2 seconds. How about now?
Yep, perfect.
Great. Hi, I'm Thea. As Maria said, I'm a project manager in the Estuaries and Wetlands team at the Zoological Society of London. And most people know the Zoological Society of London for London Zoo and Whipsnade Zoo, but we actually have a big conservation department and the Institute of Zoology, and I sit within that conservation and policy team. And I'm going to be talking a bit about our marine mammal programme and specifically the surveying for seals that we do in the Thames. And also, yeah, a big thank you for joining. I was so surprised to see how far afield people were joining from. So that's really cool to be able to talk about some of the wildlife we have in London to such a range of people from across the globe. So I'm going to talk a bit about seal populations more generally, so we can see how the Thames survey and what we find in the Thames fits into that national context. I'm going to talk a little bit about why we study the Thames seal population. And I'm also going to be talking about our public sightings network and kind of really where our team's work with seals began. And then where we are now with our research, which is our annual surveys. And then finally, I'll close with just briefly touching on some of the stakeholder engagement we do as well. So in the UK, we have 2 resident seal species. We have the harbour seal and the grey seal, both of which breed and are resident here, and both can be seen in these pictures. The shorter snout-like nose is the one that belongs to the harbour seal, and the long kind of Roman nose is the one that belongs to the grey seal, which is just in that photograph there. And very occasionally we get vagrant individuals from more northern or Arctic populations like the ringed or the harp seal that are spotted around the UK coast, but they aren't resident here. We just have the 2 species. And our grey seal is divided into 2 subspecies. We have the Atlantic and the Baltic. And within those 2 subspecies can be found in 3 populations. So we have the East Atlantic population, the West Atlantic population, and then the Baltic population. And they each have their own sizes, breeding habitats, pupping dates. And in the UK, the one we have is the East Atlantic grey seal population. The harbour seal is divided into 5 subspecies. And in Europe and in the UK, it's the Eastern Atlantic harbour seal subspecies. Habitat-wise, common seals are generally found in, or our harbour seals, common harbour, you can use them interchangeably, but they're found in sheltered coastlines, typically on sandbanks in estuaries, but also on more rocky coasts. The larger of the 2 species, the grey seal, that's found predominantly on rocky shores and cliffs, but you also do find it in estuaries, tidal flats and sandy shores. So that's why we see both in the Thames, because both species utilise the habitats we have. So the harbour seal, it's smaller than the grey seal. It's about 1.5 meters in length at full size, and they can weigh up to 100 kilos. And they can live to about 20 to 30 years. And when you see them hauled out, sometimes you'll see them in this, what people call a banana position or curve position, where the head and tail are both up. They're generalist and opportunistic feeders, I would say, and they feed on a mixed diet of fish, squid, whelks, crabs and mussels, and they'll forage about sort of a 50-kilometre range of where their haul-out sites are. And the pups of this species, they're born at the end of June, beginning of July time. And it's pretty incredible that they can swim almost immediately. Within a matter of hours, they're able to take to the water. And the range of the East Atlantic subspecies, which is the one we see in the Thames, stretches from Iceland down to northern France. So our grey seal, which its Latin name means hooked-nosed sea pig, they're the bigger of the species, so they can be up to 2.5 meters, and the males, so the bulls of the species, if you've ever seen them, you'll know how big they are, and they can weigh more than 300 kilos, and they look it. And the females slightly smaller and weigh up to about 200. And their lifespan is slightly longer than the harbour seal, so maybe 30 to 40 years, and the females are the longer lived of the species, of the two, sorry. And they're generalist feeders, same as harbour seals, and opportunistic, so they'll feed on sand eels, on flatfish, and it will kind of vary as to what's available with the season or the location. And they forage slightly more widely, so about 100 kilometres from their haul-out sites. And the pup, which you can see in the photograph, they're born autumn to winter months rather than the summer months like the harbour seal. And it's in a clockwise climb, so the southwest pups are born slightly earlier, and then it gets progressively later as you move around the country. And they're born, the white coat that you can see is called a lanugo, and that white coat isn't waterproof. So in the way that the harbour seals are pretty much ready to swim and go in the water straight away, grey seal pups will stay hauled out on dry land for about 3 weeks while they'll feed with the mother, and eventually when they lose this coat, they're ready to swim. So previously, grey seals, when I'm talking historically, were much more widespread than they are today, and they kind of had a continuous distribution along most of mainland Europe. And it was in the kind of late Middle Ages time, there was a lot of pressure around hunting, and that continued, and we saw a big decline in the abundance and range of the species. Then protective measures came in that allowed that species to recolonize, and the UK, they were quite early in introducing their ban of hunting of this species, so they kind of acted as a refuge, and we saw a recovery of the local population, which has then sort of contributed to the repopulation of much of the North Sea. And so at present, although we do have grey seals around the European mainland coast, as I mentioned, the Eastern Atlantic population really is centred around the UK and Ireland. So we're quite significant globally for this species. And our UK population of grey seals is estimated to be 157,000. And that's 35% of the world population, 82% of the European population. And these maps that I'm showing on the slide, they're prepared by the Sea Mammal Research Unit, which is based at St Andrews University, and they're an organisation who are responsible for national surveys for seals. And these maps show their most recent counts, and all the seal data that we collect at ZSL, we send back to SMRU and share with them, so it can feed into their understanding of what the species are doing as a whole around the country, and how that can inform any management advice or conservation action. There we go. So the new graph you can see on the left, that's just showing where the pupping sites are for the grey seal, and most of these breeding colonies in Scotland, especially on the island groups like the Outer Hebrides and Orkney. But we also have breeding colonies in Shetland and on the northern and eastern mainland coasts, and in Wales. And those blue ovals there, so they indicate the presence of a pupping site, and the size of that blue dot denotes how the number of pups that have been seen at those sites. There are some signs that the growth is levelling off in some of those areas. So pup production hasn't increased in the north and west of Scotland due to reductions in survival and reductions in reproduction. But in the central and southern parts of the North Sea, so near to where the Thames Estuary is, we are still seeing quite high population growth of grey seals. And although this is, I think, a really positive story for a wildlife comeback, the species still is going to face threats in the future. And one of those could be from that could be from disturbance impacts, but also from where we're seeing more extreme climate events. Those could have an impact on pupping beaches and pupping survival. Our right-hand graph shows harbour seals, which are also found in internationally important numbers in the UK. And so since hunting came to an end, we've seen a gradual recovery of harbour seals. And the UK's population is now estimated to be about 44,000 harbour seals, and that accounts for 32% of the European population. The recovery of harbour seals since the 1970s and the reduction in hunting pressure, that's been punctuated by two really significant disease events which took place in 1988 and 2002. And they were caused by this virus called porcine distemper virus, or PDV for short. And it actually had a limited impact on grey seals, but really dramatically affected harbour seal populations, especially on the east coast of England. And that left-hand graph, you can see it's just showing those two major disease events, the 1988 and the 2002, and the impact they had on harbour seal counts in the Wash, which is southeast of England, around Norfolk kind of area, which is just north of the Thames Estuary. And that was the hardest hit area in the country. Overall, the UK population has kind of increased since the late 2000s and the last known PDV epidemic. And then the counts increased rapidly between 2006 to 2012 and kind of have remained constant since. But this picture is variable across the UK. We don't see harbour seals recovered everywhere. And the the graph at the bottom shows the trajectories for different populations within different management units in Scotland. And we can see in Orkney, for example, the harbour seal population has declined by 85% between 1997 and 2016. Similarly, in the Tay Estuary, declines of 95%, and in the Shetland Islands, declines of 30%. Whereas when we look onto the west coast of Scotland, we see more stable or increasing populations. And there's ongoing research as to why that's the case, that St Andrews University and their partners are undertaking. They've ruled out a few different reasons as primary causes, and efforts are now focused on researching interactions with grey seals, because they could be as they grow in numbers, they could be competitors for habitat or prey, but also they could predate directly on harbour seals as well. So either that or exposure to toxins from harmful algae, but there's no confirmed reasons for these declines in some populations. So that's a continuing area of research. So to bring it back more locally now, about why are we studying the Thames seal population? From a ZSL point of view, it's really about gathering robust data that we can feed into that national context, in terms of the work that the Sea Mammal Research Unit are doing, but also that can inform local management within the estuary and make sure any kind of decisions are made with the best evidence available, and to kind of minimise any negative impacts on that wildlife. So firstly, though, before the early 2000s, the Greater Thames Estuary seal population is one of the least understood seal populations in the country. There was very little known about the abundance of seals in the region, whether seal populations were increasing, declining, seal ecology, like preferred fallout sites and foraging grounds, and their behaviour. And this was a huge knowledge gap that ZSL and partners like Bramley Associates, based in Kent, and the Sea Mammal Research Unit have been gathering vital ecological data to fill over the past 20 years. And secondly, seals are an example of a top predator in what is the UK's busiest inland waterway. So we're in an urban environment. There are several potential threats to this wildlife, including boat traffic and construction. And if we can, like I said, if we can study and understand these populations, that means we can provide the scientific evidence that will underpin their management. We can provide evidence that might help protect haul-out sites or known important pupping sites. And as top predators, they also provide an indicator of general ecological health. So this is particularly relevant for harbour seals, who I mentioned at the beginning have a smaller foraging range than grey seals, so are possibly able to tell us more about the immediate environment. And in order for these animals to thrive in the Thames Estuary, there has to be the food available and the habitat available for them. So if they're not doing well, they might give us an indication that there is of what else is not doing so well in the estuary, basically. And the Thames estuary is also really sheltered coastline and in sandbanks, which is the preferred habitat of harbour seals. And these sandbanks out in the Greater Thames Estuary, they expose at low tide, and they're a significant habitat feature for the estuary itself. And above the waterline, those sandbanks, they provide places for seals to haul out, to give birth, to feed, to rest. Those sandbanks, the kind of subtidal morphology, also offers conditions suitable for several prey species. So it's an optimum place for harbour seals, but we also have a situation where we're close to a very growing population of grey seals. And those harbour and grey seals, as I said, they share similar resources, and the increase in both species in the region could lead to increased competition. And so, considering some of the dramatic declines we're seeing of harbour seals elsewhere in parts of Scotland, that Thames estuary population become increasingly important, sort of in the national context, and important to monitor those changes in numbers. And lastly, another important reason why we study the Thames seal population is that the harbour seal population on the east coast of England, that was reduced by over half after the 1988 PDV epidemic. And research showed that the epidemic, the epicenter of it was around waters near Denmark and Sweden, and then there were waves of PDV transmission came from that. So in terms of the UK, if there is another outbreak of disease from Europe, the Thames estuary could easily be one of the potential entry points and act as an early warning system. So our Thames seal programme, it has three main components to it. It has the public sightings network, it has the dedicated annual surveys, and we also have stakeholder engagement through it was called the Greater Thames Seal Working Group, and that's with other conservation NGOs, with government and with industry. And the aims of our programme are twofold. We want to ensure seal conservation and management is informed by robust data, which comes from the survey work. And we want to raise awareness that the Thames estuary is also essential habitat to wildlife, not just seals, but fish and other species, which is why it's really great to come to things like this and be able to talk to people about how incredible the Thames is, and that it really is a central wildlife habitat. So our public sightings network, in 2004, ZSL launched the Thames Marine Mammal Sighting Survey, and the purpose of it is to collect opportunistic public sightings of marine mammals in the Greater Thames Estuary, and that's not just seals, but it could be porpoises, dolphins as well. And this was a way to start gathering reports that are sent in from members of the public and build up that long-term data set about the presence of these animals in the Thames. And it helps us cover a large area that we couldn't otherwise do. And it's a great way for the public to get involved in marine conservation. It's a fantastic engagement tool. And the Thames sightings map, it covers the whole tidal Thames. So for those local, you might know Teddington Lock in the west, that's the tidal limit of the Thames, and that continues all the way out east to the mouth of the river and what we call the Greater Thames Estuary. Most of the sightings we receive are from central London, most likely because the density of the people there more than anything else. And most commonly the reports we get are of single seals, but then occasionally people do report groups. We've had 42 seals hauled out at Canvey Island that people reported through the sightings app. And we also get some incredible photos through with the submissions. I've shown a few examples on this slide. And the behaviour that people generally mostly observe, unsurprisingly, is swimming. And this data we've had almost 3,000 sightings. It's been fantastically useful to tell us that we see these animals all through central London, all the way up to Teddington. It tells us about presence and absence, and we can infer sort of general trends from this data. But because it's not effort-based, so we don't know when people have been looking for a marine mammal and not seen a marine mammal, we can't necessarily use it to calculate an abundance. So that's where our seal population surveys come in. So to be able to make population estimates of seals in the Greater Thames Estuary, we do dedicated scientific counts. And these counts began in the Thames Estuary in 2003, and they were completed by the Sea Mammal Research Unit, and they weren't necessarily done annually, but pockets of the Greater Thames Estuary and Ken were also surveyed in between by an organisation called Bramby Associates. So prior to this, the work from Bramley Associates and Sea Mammal Research Unit, the use of sandbanks off the North Kent coast as haul sites was largely unknown outside of the Margate Sands complex, which is, you can see Margate on the map actually in the red square, so just north of there are the sandbanks. And then in 2013, ZSL, together with Bramley Associates and Sea Mammal Research Unit, or SMRU, we've been completing annual surveys of, since 2013, we've been completing annual surveys of the estuary, and that produces a sum account for both species, and we can use that to estimate the population size. So the survey area we cover is broadly shown where the red line is. It basically goes as far east as Gravesend, goes down to Deal in Kent and up to Felixstowe in Suffolk, and it covers all the coastline and the sandbanks in between. And they're completed over a few days, and it takes place during the first 2 weeks of August. And the reason we do it then is because harbour seals are molting at this period of time. So each year the seals lose and regrow their coat, and that process of molting is energetically expensive, so they spend more time reliably hauled out. So it's provides a consistent time point at which we are in a better position to survey the numbers, and that's consistent with the survey method used nationally. So all of it makes the data more comparable. So how do we cover all this coastline, all this sandbanks? Is that we'd use a small fixed wing plane like the one shown in the top left of the slide. And the aerial surveys, they'll take place 2 hours either side of low tide, and that's when the sandbanks will be exposed. And 2 of us go in the plane with a pilot, and we cover a portion of the estuary looking for seals from the sky. And basically we cover in one day, on one low tide, we'll cover the southern part of the estuary, and then we'll cover the middle part of the estuary, and we call that the South End route, and the northern part we call the Felixstowe route. And essentially, as we're out spotting, looking for seals, as soon as we encounter a group, we will make a rough note of how many we see, and then we make sure we record a GPS location. We have a handheld GPS unit and a very large lens camera, and we take lots of photos. Although they're easy to spot from, well, relatively easy to spot from the sky. To be able to quickly count groups, especially when they're big, and species ID from the sky is particularly when you don't want to circle the plane multiple times, because if you do that for too long, you could disturb the seals. For those reasons, we take lots of photographs, and we do the final counts and the final species ID in the office, and 2 of us do it together, and we kind of verify. Where we do it separately, and where you disagree, we come together and verify what we see. And it's those counts that we then scale up to calculate our population estimate. And the factor by which you scale up takes account of the proportion of animals which are likely to still be at sea, because it's impossible to carry out a survey of a marine mammal and have every single individual from the Thames on a sandbank. So we have to kind of account for that proportion of animals at sea. And although it's the harbour seal molt in August, and that's what we time the survey for, we're also able to record summer grey seal presence through this. And those counts can also be scaled up to produce a population estimate. I want to give you some example of some of the photos that we've seen, that we've taken, while on surveys. I think you'll agree this one is, in terms of count, is a relatively straightforward one to do. I'll give you a few seconds to spot. And so that's a straightforward one. We know there's 10 seals there. This one I think is slightly more challenging. I'll give people a few minutes to try and spot all the seals hauled out. And well done if you managed to spot all 16. And they can be quite, hopefully I've demonstrated this, they can be quite well camouflaged on some of the sandbanks. When it's sand, the sandbanks out in the wider estuary, they're easier to spot, but when you see them on these grassy banks, they can sometimes be a bit tricky. And then we come across huge groups like this, which is amazing. And you take the way to have strategy with the camera is we take an overview shot of the whole group, and then we take a whole series of overlapping shots to be able to get close up enough to do all the counts, but also to ID whether they are harbour or grey seals. And by the end of the analysis of all the photographs, I think my vision goes totally blurry. But that's in just that one group that we come across, that's 247 seals. So it can be, we see multiple groups of that size during the survey. So these population surveys we've continued them annually to 2021. We had to miss 2020 due to the COVID pandemic, and in 2022, so last year, we weren't able to mobilise the survey team because of capacity and funding. So the Sea Mammal Research Unit kindly stepped in and they did the survey in 2022, but we intend to be back out surveying this summer, 2023. So you'll see in August 2021, we have a total count of almost 500 harbour seals, and that compares with an average of 735 for 3 surveys between 2017 and 2019, and an average of 535 between 2014 and 2016. So harbour seal population stayed relatively constant until 2016. Then we saw a marked increase, an increase by 16% between 2013 and 2016. And then since 2017, there appears to be been a gradual decline. We do expect natural variation, and although you do your best to make sure these results are as accurate as possible, there's obviously some there'll be fluctuation year to year and a different proportion of animals at sea and various other factors. But that's why we are so keen to get out this summer to find out if that is genuinely a true population decline and something that could be a cause for concern, or whether it is just natural variation. And there have been some reports of a decline in the Wash, which is that population in Norfolk, north of the Thames. And so it'd be interesting to observe is that something we're seeing in the Thames, or if, as I said, it's just a natural fluctuation. Grey seals, on the other hand, have steadily increased, and that's consistent with the rest of the east coast of England. And interestingly, more than double the number of grey seals were encountered in 2014 than in 2013. And that's possibly in response to the growth of grey seal breeding populations along the east coast of England. And then numbers stayed relatively constant until 2017, and then we see another sizable increase in grey seals. The eagle-eyed amongst you will have noticed that there appears to have been a slight decline in 2021, but that was actually us not being able to access one of the sandbanks, one of the outer sandbanks called Kentish Knock. And that group previously has been grey seal dominated and approximately 200 seals. So we don't think that number reflects a decline in grey seals. It's just a methodology issue that year. And so this is a map of all the GPS locations of where we saw seals and the counts. And as I've highlighted there, the Kentish Knock outer sandbank, which would normally have a grey seal dominated group there. And the circles show our harbour seals and the triangles are the grey seals. And Goodwin Sands, which is the southernmost haul out site that you can see on the map, with all the triangles and dots over it, is a really important haul out site in the region, and it often accounts for a really large proportion of grey seals that we identified during the survey. It's also possible that Goodwin Sands is an important haul out site for seals that travel from mainland Europe to the UK, as it's one of the most easterly and southerly sandbanks in the Greater Thames Estuary. And it would be really interesting to do work like photo ID or tagging work to be able to track where different seals come from and the journeys they take. And then for harbour seals, the major haul out sites have been coastal spots like Pegwell Bay, which is just adjacent, just west of the Goodwin Sands site, Dengie Flats, which is not that far around from Southend. I think someone on the call was from Southend, So that is in your direction. And in Hanford Water, which is just north towards Felixstowe, that's a regular hotspot for harbour seals when we do our surveys. We also carried out our first survey for harbour seal pups in 2018. As mentioned at the beginning, harbour seal, they pup in the summer just before the molt, and they're born ready to swim almost immediately, which is different to the grey seals that have the fluffy coat and they stay hauled out for several weeks. And because of that, it's not thought that grey seals breed in the Thames. There have been reports of the odd pup each year, but because of the really high tidal nature of the Thames, there's not enough dry areas at high tide for the pups to stay on while they have their non-waterproof coats. So it's not thought to be a main breeding or pupping site for grey seals. But for the harbour seal pups, that survey design, it's the same as what we do for a population survey. We just do it slightly earlier at the end of June, start of July, when we expect to see that peak number of pups. And for our first survey in 2018, we recorded 138 pups. And prior to this, only one breeding survey had been completed on the Kent and Essex coastlines, and that was by the Sea Mammal Research Unit in 2011, and that recorded 47 harbour seal pups. So that might suggest we're seeing an increase in harbour seal numbers, not just because of movement from other colonies, but also that more animals are having their pups in the Thames. In July 2021, we also tried to repeat the pup survey, but unfortunately bad weather meant we could only fly 2 out of the 3 survey days. So we found 21 harbour seal pups, which adds to the kind of evidence base that the Thames is an important nursery ground for harbour seals, an important pupping site, but unfortunately we can't get an overall pup count for that data. Sorry, and that was just showing the different sites, which is the same as I was mentioning before, that often Pegwell and Hanford Water were shown as being hotspots for them. But yeah, unfortunately, we couldn't get that third and final day done. So the annual surveys, they provide us with a long-term baseline understanding of population trends in the Greater Thames Estuary, and we'll be able to track that over the long term. But they occur over a few days in a year, so they definitely are also a snapshot in time. And that information about seal movement within the estuary, their behaviour and their distribution throughout other times of the year are still largely unknown. And so we started a project, should have been a few years ago now, to see if we could use camera traps across haul-out sites that we knew from our surveys in the estuary that would maybe be able to track those seasonal variations a little better. And we deployed these camera traps in the estuary and linked it to ZSL's online Instant Wild platform. And this basically enabled us to share all the images that were coming from the camera traps directly to members of the public who would sign into Instant Wild and basically be able to ID what animals were in the shots. We had 2 cameras in the Hanford Water site in Essex, which I mentioned, and they were set to take images every hour. And in total, we had over 11,000 images over the course of the project. So a big thank you to all the members of the public who went through those images. And I think they had lots of pictures of just mud, as well as pictures of seals. And we were interested to see that the seasonal presence of seals actually showed fewer seals per image during the summer months rather than versus the winter months, which was slightly unexpected because harbour seals will be hauled out to molt and for the pupping periods of their lives in the summer months. But we thought there could be a few explanations for this. Boat traffic, which is going to be greater in the summer, probably will dissuade seals from congregating possibly. Herring shoals also congregate inland before spawning in January and February, and they're a major food source for seals in the UK. So this could have attracted seals inland to these sites. And maybe inland sites like Hanford Water, they provide shelter from kind of wind and inclement weather in winter months. These conditions and haul-out sites are really variable across the estuary. So I think we can only infer about a handful of water from here. And we also face quite a few challenges with this project in terms of deploying camera traps in a very tidal, muddy environment. But it was a really useful insight into how you have the potential to use camera traps for a project like this, and how the use of haul-out sites could vary seasonally. And lastly, I just wanted to touch on some of the stakeholder engagement work we do. In 2013, we set up the Greater Thames Estuary Working Group, and that's a group of stakeholders. They're across the Thames. It's fishers, government bodies, other NGOs like ourselves, and academics. And it's just an opportunity for people to share updates of the work they're doing. We also can provide updates on the count data. And an example of this partnership working is this action plan, which I'm just showing here. And the Thames is home to seals, but also porpoises, dolphins, and occasionally a whale. And as the water of the Thames gets cleaner, we hope, we expect the numbers of these animals will increase. And so often members of the public might spot a seal hauled out on the mudflats and think that that's an animal in trouble, and contact different organisations like the police, the RNLI. Ooh. That's just closed, right? Sorry. And so this was just about sort of publicising to people what would be considered normal behaviour for a seal, because they spend a surprising amount of time hauled out for a marine mammal, what was behaviour that would be cause for concern, and kind of the different actions to take if members of the public see a marine mammal in the river. So that all kind of feeds into our raising public awareness of these animals and what to do if you see an animal in trouble. And I think that's me. So yeah, thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit more about these amazing animals that call the Thames their home. I'm just going to stop sharing. There we go.
Thank you so much, Thea. That was really fascinating. And just so to sort of gives an idea about how important that kind of survey work is to understand, you know, populations of seals that probably very little was known about until relatively recently. It's amazing, and yet it is, you know, kind of a significant part of the seal population. So it's fantastic to hear that work, and good luck with the 2023 survey. Hope that kind of all runs smoothly. We've got quite a few questions in the chat. Can I just sort of ask at the beginning if you could just say a little bit more about the virus, the PDV that they've been suffering from? And I was just going to ask about, is the recovery in numbers just due to a build up in natural immunity, or is there anything else that's kind of helped?
So I'm unfortunately, I'm not a disease expert myself, so I don't know the details of PDV too much, like the nature of the virus. But obviously it caused severe population crashes. In terms of the recovery of numbers, I don't think it's necessarily whether they've might be a built up immunity, or it's just that it just passes through the population. And so far, we haven't seen it return, but I suppose it's a matter of you watch population numbers and see what happens. But I don't know a huge amount about the ins and outs of PDV, just because I don't work on the disease side of it. But.
Yeah, thank you. But it's obviously when it does run through, it has quite a noticeable impact on populations. Yeah. And you know, I was just kind of thinking, is it one of those things that's likely to recur? And the two sort of bouts of it were quite close together, weren't they? They weren't particularly sort of spaced far apart.
And they do expect it's likely that we would see it again, and kind of based on the timings, I think before people were expecting it relatively imminently, but it doesn't seem to have, touch wood, so far have happened. But it is likely to return in cycles, basically.
Okay, so anyway, well, let's hope they kind of do as well as they can for as long as they can. Anchor, I've seen a lot of questions come through on the chat, so do you want to start picking some of those up?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just going to stick with the disease theme here, unfortunately, but Lucia was wondering, about bird flu and seals. She said, since mink can get it, can seals get it as well?
Yes, it has been shown that it can transfer to seals. I think they've had cases over in the US, but so yes, it will do. Unfortunately, the kind of the scale of potential impact from that, if it did spread throughout seal populations, is kind of unknown. So again, it's a bit like the PDV with a watching brief, and we have a team at the zoo who, for example, they work on doing the cetacean stranding investigation program, CSIP. They work a lot on doing postmortems on washed up dead cetaceans, and have also more recently been looking at seals as well. So then they have advice that they follow in terms of trying to reduce any risk of accelerating any spread. And we would ask any members of the public who see a carcass on the beach not to touch it, not to go near it, because that could spread any disease as well. But yeah, it does have the potential. Avian flu does have the potential to hop to seals.
Well, that's not good. No, I have two other questions that are related, so I'm just going to ask them together, and they're not really happy questions either. Harry was wondering if pollution is another factor that would affect seal populations in the Thames, and if so, what can be done to mitigate it? And related to that, Gillian was wondering if you knew about the Teddington, the Thames Water Teddington scheme, or there's a possibility basically that they may extract something, let me get the, anyway, many millions of liters of water a day from the Thames upstream at Teddington, and then replace it with treated sewer effluent. That is one possibility. So what impact would that have, do you think?
So yeah, I would say pollution definitely has potential to impact seals, as it does with any wildlife, particularly if it's going to impact how fish populations, and that's prey for the seals. So you would expect there to be some impact. We did see a big improvement in water quality in the Thames, and generally across Europe, when we had the kind of advent of big scale sewage treatment works. But I think since then, things have slightly plateaued, and there's a lot of work to be done, and some things are being done, like the Thames Super Sewer and the Thames Tideway Tunnel. In terms of what we can do, there are things we can do on kind of like on an individual scale, with making sure we don't have misconnections in our home, which will mean that pollution reaches our rivers. But there's also a lot of work to be done more on sort of national scale with improving infrastructure, and a lot of that work is hopefully being pushed to the forefront with climate change, and we're expected to have more extreme rain events, which could mean obviously more pressure on existing infrastructure. So I think there's hopefully a drive to go in that direction and make improvements, but pollution will have the potential to impact seals, as it does with all wildlife.
Sorry, I was muted there. Well, again, and another impact that Michelle was wondering about is she was wondering if the ZSL was aware of the plan to bring Europe's biggest party boat to the Thames. This is called the Ocean Diva, and it's 282 feet long and 50 feet wide, 3 decks, so it would be the biggest vessel of its kind to use the Thames regularly. It is currently seeking a 2:30 a.m. license with up to 2 parties a day, 365 days a year. So she's saying, do seals have a problem getting out of the way of large vessels like this? Does the scour create problems for them, or the noise, or the flashing lights?
You do see some evidence of seals that have been they have vessel impact injuries, so that's not out of the question that could be the case. And I don't have exact figures or data on the impacts of light pollution and the impacts of noise, but you would definitely think that if they're above a certain threshold, they could have an effect on seals. A lot of the seals do move up through tidal Thames and through London, as we can see from the sightings map, but the bigger groups tend to haul out in the outer parts of the estuary. My concern, I suppose, with the development like that might be the impact on the fish that are in the Thames, who could be very sensitive to light, particularly when a lot of migratory species use the Thames, and some different phases of their life cycle, including spawning, can be influenced by lunar cycles and other things. So then if you have artificial light, that can affect fish populations. So that might be something that could be concerning. I don't know the ins and outs of that specific development plan, the application for the vessel, so I couldn't say exactly, but yeah, it doesn't sound great for wildlife in the river.
There's another question here, which I think many people kind of do wonder about. Does the Thames barrier, the opening and the closing, ever present an issue for seals or other marine mammals in the river?
Yes, I suppose it's a physical barrier, so you would be preventing animals moving up and down. I suppose with all those things, it's the regularity on which the closures occur, and the duration of those closures. But it is effectively a physical barrier there. But as far as I'm aware, it doesn't close really on a super regular basis. So I wouldn't have thought you would see a kind of population level impact on seals in the Thames as a result of the operation of the barrier. But I'm willing to be corrected on that, but I don't anticipate it would do.
I think they're planning on building a second one to help prevent flooding in London.
Yeah, they'll probably be looking at part of their kind of future risk scenarios. I think they would probably be looking at something like that.
Yeah, I think there is a Thames Barrier 2 plan, but I can't remember now the details. Well,
can I just ask about the movement of seals up and down the Thames? Is there a lot of movement, or is it more sort of where they've just gone a bit astray, and because they're also presumably not in ideal conditions once they get a long way up, or is it part of the cycle is they do move up and down right up into sort of London?
Yeah, I mean now we believe it's part of their natural habitat and a natural movement upriver. We don't think it's I wouldn't have considered it seals have gone astray, because it would all be part of their natural habitat. We think generally they'll be following food up, they would follow fish in that direction. In terms of actual numbers that go up the river, because the only evidence we have of that is through the Public Sightings app, and we can't extract abundance data from that because it's not a formal survey. All we can really say is presence absence. So we know they go up the river. We don't think that's abnormal behaviour. Yeah, when we reported sightings like that, we think that's just them using part of their habitat, their expected range. And yeah, we think it's likely that they would be following food. So, but yeah, it's unfortunate you can't derive sort of total counts or abundance of them up the river. But it's great to be able to share with people that they are there. It's good to be able to evidence that they do use the river all the way up through central London.
Yeah, and we had somebody on the chat who'd actually spotted and reported something their friend knew about the kind of need to report something. So that was really great. We had a sort of actual example. Sorry, Anchor, I jumped in a bit there. If we got a couple more questions, maybe a couple more questions.
There are a few more, and these are kind of more general ones, not doom and gloom, sad ones. But so Veronica was saying that she didn't realize that they lost their coat that they molted, and she was asking, do both grey and harbour seals molt? And William was asking if the seals mix or do they keep apart, the harbor seal populations and the gray seal populations?
Yes, they're both molt, and the groups do mix. So sometimes you'll fly over a sandbank and see both species occupying the same area. You can sometimes see them sort of all intermixed within the same group, but often you'll see grey seals quite closely bunched towards the sort of closer to the water, and you'll see harbour seals generally in smaller groups, more scattered up towards the top of the shore. And that's a bit of a generalization just from lots of the surveys we've done, but that's kind of generally the pattern of haul out behavior that you see. So sometimes you might see them, they'll be occupying the same beach or section of foreshore, but they'll be separated. But you do sometimes see them intermixing, which is interesting because then there's also the argument that their competitors, but also that grey seals have been known also to predate on harbour seals. So, but they occupy the same spaces.
There were also some questions about kind of the surveys and also how people can get involved. So William was wondering if the evidence from your surveys has been used to affect any coastal plans or policies, into planning applications for coastal developments, etc. And other people were wondering if they could respond to any consultations and how they can get involved.
Cool. So for our data, in terms of sort of the consultation side of things, occasionally we get consultants who are doing developments in the Thames that make requests for the data, so they can obviously take it into account for their environmental impact assessments. And we've shared it when there's been applications to do certain activities involving dredging in the river, in the estuary, sorry. So we'll share data that we have that, where we know are used as haul out sites or as pupping sites by seals. And we've also shared it with sort of the regulators like Natural England, and we work with them through the Greater Thames Seal Working Group, so that sort of one of the original aims of the group, of the programme, the seal programme from a ZSL point of view, is that it does get taken account in these developments and in these applications. And I think you say someone said, how could they respond to consultations? I think most, if not all, are public. It's just a matter of how well they're publicised and having to keep track of what is published on each council. And for us, we try our best to keep up with it, but there's obviously a lot of applications, and fortunately there's an organisation called Wildlife and Countryside Link, which often coordinate responses from NGOs, so that's helpful. In terms of volunteering, with the harbour seal, with the seal survey, it's obviously limited because it's only 2 of us in a plane, but we do encourage people to use the app. And where we have projects like the camera traps, if a project like that comes online again, we'd publicise that through our Facebook and through our Twitter pages. And beyond kind of the marine mammal work, there's an opportunity to volunteer with ZSL through our London Rivers work. So we do outfall safaris, which are surveying for, I mentioned misconnections earlier, as kind of something that we can work on kind of individually, but we do surveys to map these misconnections and sources of pollution, and we can feed that data back to Thames Water or other water companies, and they can work with homeowners and councils to address those misconnections. So there's opportunities like that with the River Fly Monitoring Initiative, and also with eel monitoring across London's rivers. And all those types of volunteering opportunities are through volunteering for London Rivers. So there's a sign up page, so I can drop the link in the chat.
Yeah,
but that's where kind of our main opportunities come from.
That would be great if you pop the link in there, and then I can kind of pick that up and send it out when I send out the email about the recording to everybody as well. So yeah, that would be really helpful. Thank you. Yeah, so somebody said just sort of say that. Oh yeah, what's the kind of coordinating
The wildlife and countryside link, I can drop that in as well. I'll put a note in.
Perfect.
And
Yeah,
also perhaps the name of the app itself that for the sightings.
Oh yeah, I'll drop all those. The Thames Marine Mammal Sightings app. I can drop that in.
that's perfect. Thank you. And we're on 8 o'clock, so I think we've probably picked up everything from the chat. Is that?
There are a few.